Hello, everyone. I just perhaps give it a minute just to ensure everyone is back from making the coffee. Okay, I think B is with us. You're on mute at the moment. B, our first speaker.
Hello. Yes,
Hello,
I'm here. Hello. Hello. Happy
Hi,
to
how are you, B?
be
Just
with you.
checking in with you. B is our first speaker in our second session. She is a professor of social policy and director of the Herman de Leek Centre for Social Policy at the University of Antwerp. And B's paper is Disappointing Poverty Trends. Why did welfare states become less pro-poor and what should be done? B, I'll hand it over to you.
Okay, thank you. I hope that you can see my PowerPoint. I have shared my, okay, good. So I can start. Thank you so much for the invitation, and please make, when I'm running out of time, give me a signal. Okay, so what I want to share with you is the idea that increasing poverty trends are or were a very common experience in all rich welfare states since let's say the second half of the 80s. And that this is related to systemic changes of the welfare state itself, that the changing policy paradigm, the social investment policy paradigm, which was basically also the idea of the Lisbon strategy, that this paradigm was not, or was only partly an appropriate answer to this systemic, what I would call systemic crisis of the welfare state, and that today we need to think about a new policy paradigm. And as Santini said in her introduction and her presentation of the European Pillar of Social Rights, I indeed believe that the European Pillar of Social Rights is the beginning of the start of the implementation of a new policy paradigm. What I want to do is just start and looking at disappointing poverty trends, not only in the past 2 decades, but looking at a longer period of time. Then going into the basic features of the post-war virtuous cycle, and so the basic paradigm, welfare state paradigm. Then I will try to pinpoint the reasons why since the 80s there has been a breakdown of this virtuous circle. Then very shortly I will say something about why the active welfare state was not successful. And then in a last slide, I will end with some proposals for the future. So let me start with the poverty trends. The focus is on active age. And if we look at poverty trends over a longer period of time, here I'm looking at the period 99 to 2019 in many countries, and you probably you can't read the countries that are in the figure, doesn't matter. What I want to show is that increasing poverty trends among the active age population has been a very common experience in all member states, and not only in the EU actually. The green line, that is Denmark, one of the most successful welfare states in the world, but with a steady increase of poverty, at risk of poverty among the active age population. And this has also been the experience in many other countries. If we focus on European countries, these are let's say the strong welfare states in the EU: Belgium, Denmark, Finland, and the Netherlands. And as you can see, this increasing a slow trend, but a clear upward trend. If we then look at the groups at risk, or the groups that have been exposed to increasing risk, then it's shown for the Netherlands, Finland, Sweden, and Denmark. Basically, the two big risk groups are the jobless households and the low-skilled. And jobless households, so these are the households who are most dependent on social protection and on the welfare state. There what we see is that the poverty risk has reached extremely high levels. In the Netherlands, 60% of jobless households are at risk of poverty. In Finland, almost the same. In Sweden, it's more than 80%. In Denmark, 60%. So for those households who are most dependent on the welfare state, in these rich and most developed welfare states in the world, the large majority of these households for a large majority of these households, social protection has become inadequate. And as a consequence, what we do observe everywhere is increasing food help, and also the EU as an important, increasingly important player in food help. I'm referring to FEAT as part of the structural fund. So the question is related to welfare states that have become smaller. Well, if we look at the statistics, this doesn't seem to be the case. If we take social spending, this is net social spending. 1995, 2017, in the rich EU welfare states, what we do see is increasing trend. So the net social spending is higher, or was high, and now especially it's much higher in 2020, 2021. As compared to the mid-90s. So welfare states actually are working harder, and the people in the welfare states are working harder. These are the employment rates in the same countries, and with big differences, but clear upward trends in all these countries. So there is a puzzle. On the one hand, increasing poverty risks among those who are most dependent on the welfare state, but on the other hand, welfare states that are working harder and the people in the welfare states are working harder. So how can we explain this? Many possible explanations. Some will refer to neoliberalism, to the idea that welfare states had been retrenched. Some will say, well, this is linked to inefficient policies. Some will say cynic politicians. Some will say, well, the paradigms, underlying paradigms, didn't work. My hypothesis is that this puzzle of increasing poverty trends, so welfare states that are becoming less protective on the one hand, but welfare states that at the same time are working harder than ever. This is linked to a systemic crisis, a structural crisis of the welfare state. And in order to explain this, I go back to the post-war welfare state, les Trente Glorieuses, and if we try to summarize the underlying paradigm of the post-war welfare state, this was full employment for men. This was increasing wages and increasing wage share in the national income, and poverty reduction basically through work and social security and also social promotion. So this was the very successful paradigm and the very successful virtuous circle of increasing work, full employment for men, which means high incomes for the workers and their families, but also higher incomes for the welfare state and particularly for social security systems. And this leads to a decreasing poverty and decreasing inequalities. Okay, this was successful, and this virtuous circle, it was the experience in welfare states, in post-war welfare states in the 50s, the 60s, and also until the 70s. However, since the beginning of the 80s, we see that this virtuous circle starts to break down for basically as a consequence of economic changes, the post-industrial transition, and the impact on the labor markets, changing women's role and the impact on the social and demographic composition of societies, and individualization. And this led to, first of all, an unequal distribution of jobs, unequal distribution of jobs among individuals and among households. And secondly, a sluggish growth of low earnings, which was at least partially endogenous, so was at least partly linked to the welfare state and social market economies in globalized and in the post-industrial transition. If we look at employment, so increasing employment rates, this is Belgium. Employment rates in Belgium are not that high, so Belgium is in a sense not a very good example, but what you see here is the experience in all welfare states, and that is that employment growth benefited the high-skilled and the middle-skilled, but did not benefit the low-skilled. So if we look at employment rates according to schooling, the blue line is the employment rates among the low-skilled. It's less than 40% since the beginning of 2000. So for 2 decades, the employment rate among the low skilled is only 40%. If we look at the Netherlands, Netherlands are much more successful as it comes to employment rate, with very much higher employment rates among the low skilled than, for instance, in Belgium. But even in the Netherlands, the employment rates among the low skilled has never been higher than 60%, which means 40% of the low skilled during these 2 decades have been in structural underemployment. This unequal distribution of increasing jobs was reinforced at the household level. And the reason is very simple. Low skilled tend to be married or in partnership with low skilled, and the high skilled tend to be married and in partnership with the high skilled. So those who benefited from job growth, namely the high skilled, they reinforced their position at the household level, and as a consequence there has been a polarization of jobs across households. And what we do see is a significant increase of the number of job-rich households. On the one hand, these are the households on the red line in the figures, and a number of individuals, jobless households, which the numbers remained more or less at the same level. More or less 10% of the active age population belongs to a jobless household. So first point, the unequal distribution of jobs among households. The second point refers to wages. The wage trend, as we all now know, has been a decoupling of wages and national income. But more importantly, what we do observe is that the low wages, that the growth of low wages was much slower than the growth of average wages. And here, this is Australia, the Netherlands, and Belgium. The red line are the minimum wages. The black line are the average wages, and the gray line refers to productivity, GDP per hour worked. And as we clearly can see, since the beginning of the 90s, there has been a decoupling of the average wage compared to productivity growth, but also, and this is extremely important, there has been a decoupling of the minimum wage compared to average wages. And this, of course, is a strategic point for social security and social protection, because low wages act as a kind of glass ceiling on the social protection levels in social security and social assistance. The polarization between job-rich households on the one hand and job-poor households on the other hand also contributed to a dualization of social security. On the one hand, social security has had to take care of so-called new social risks. Think about parental leave, childcare, etc. These new social risks are more prevalent among job-rich households by definition. And on the other hand, Social Security had to deal with the old social risk, continue to deal with all social risk because of the continuing high levels of unemployment among the low skilled. So the old social risk, but all social risks which are concentrated among vulnerable households, but also households and individuals who do not have the capacity to contribute to social security because of their vulnerable position on the labor market and the low wages when they are able to work. Importantly, this glass ceiling of the social minima, as minimum wages are decreasing compared to median incomes, then this a fortiori also means that the lag behind median incomes, and this is what happened in the past 2 decades. There has been downward pressure on minimum wages, and as a consequence, also a downward pressure on the social floor. And the situation today is that in almost all countries in the EU, the social floor is inadequate. The social floor, social minimum benefits are below the at risk of poverty threshold, below the European poverty line. So this is basically what happened in the past 2 or 3 decades. So we are talking about a long period of time. Welfare states adapted and became active, and welfare states became less protective, but put more strength on social investment. So there has been this social investment turn, and basically the idea of the active welfare state and of the social investment welfare state was to reinvigorate the post-war virtuous circle of work, income, and poverty reduction. So basically the idea, also the idea of the Lisbon strategy was, well, if we can increase employment rates, if we can increase the number of people in work, this will be beneficial for them, because they will get a higher income from work, and this will be beneficial for the welfare state, more income, more taxes, more social contributions, and this will allow to reduce poverty directly, because people in work, the poverty risk among people in work is lower, and indirectly because the state revenues will increase, and that will be beneficial for social protection and for social policies. However, what happened is that in the new social and economic constellation, the new jobs came with a price. Secondly, the new jobs did not always protect against poverty. And thirdly, social protection became less pro-poor. If we look at this is Belgium as an example. The new jobs came with a cost, with a price. This is the spending on new social risks in Belgium, which has been significant since the 90s, and these are spending that accrue more to job-rich households and job-poor households. So this is spending. With Matthew's effect attached to them. Jobs protect less against poverty. This is the problem of in-work poverty. These are the trends in Belgium, Germany, France, the Netherlands, in the 2000s in all these countries at different levels, but in all these countries, upward trends. And thirdly, and this is extremely important, that is social spending as a whole became less pro-poor because of the pressures on the protection of those of the most vulnerable, those the low skilled on the labor market on the one hand, but on the other hand, increasing share of social spending accruing to job-rich households in order to cover the so-called new social risks. And so again, this dualization in social spending, on the one hand, spending on new social risk with mature effects attached to them, and spending a lower spending on jobless households. So welfare states started to work harder, but they became less protective for the vulnerable. They became less pro-poor. And that is the reason why work and poverty reduction were not reconciled. This refers to the book I wrote together with Frank van den Broeke, as trying to answer the question why Lisbon strategy was not successful. Well, this is the answer. The Lisbon strategy was not able to reconcile work and poverty reduction. Why not? Well, because basically it started from the naive idea that the post-war virtuous circle could be reinstored, whereas in the new labor market and in the new social, economic and demographic constellation of societies, this is simply not possible anymore. And basically the welfare states are struggling with what I would call a social trilemma. It has become very difficult and probably not possible anymore to reconcile, on the one hand, budgetary restraint, income inequality of poverty reduction, and employment growth. So welfare states have to make choices between spending, between poverty, or between employment. And so different welfare states try to find solutions. If we look, for instance, Sweden was the focus in the past decades on budgetary restraint and restraint on social protection. Employment kept rising, but poverty increased dramatically. In Belgium, employment growth was rather slow, but there has been an increase in social spending, and poverty increased. And actually, in all welfare states in the EU and beyond, poverty increased, at least poverty among the active age population. So what can be done? Well, I think that we should talk about and think about a paradigm shift. And I also believe that the European Pillar of Social Rights is opening avenues to a changing policy paradigm. In contrast to the Lisbon strategy, where the focus was on employment and on activation and on social investment, now the increase of minimum wages is very prominent there. And as I explained, the increase of minimum wages is key in the whole process. Minimum wage is the floor of the welfare state. So the lagging behind minimum wages and low wages compared to average wages and national income has been a very important element explaining why welfare states were not successful in eradication poverty in the past. So increasing minimum wages, extremely important. Increase the social floor. There I refer to Principle 14 of the European Pillar. And also, we should start to think about partial basic income. And partial basic income, in my view, it's related, or it must go together with the increase of the social floor in social assistance. And I do believe that we need both of them, but maybe we can come back to that in the discussion. We should invest in low productivity jobs. It's very important, in my view, that this is prominent in the European Pillar of Social Rights and in the initiatives of the Commission. Thirdly, increase the access to social protection, which means, in a sense, a decoupling of a partial decoupling of social and work. If we want to protect platform workers, for instance, then we need to make the access to social protection less rigid, and we need to decouple, at least partially, social rights and work. And then, as a last point, important, because all this is costly. And so poverty reduction is not a cheap option. It's not easy. It comes with a price, and therefore I think it's absolutely important to include wealth and carbon taxation in the whole distributional process. Okay, this was my last slide. I hope I was more or less intact. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Bea. Thank you. A very interesting take on the changes that we have gone through in terms of affecting those in poverty. Our next speaker is Lina Carr. Lina was re-elected European Trade Union Confederation Confederal Secretary in 2019, having been first elected in 2015. Her responsibilities at ETUC include macroeconomic policy, economic governance, and the European semester, the European Pillar of Social Rights and Social Protection. Her paper is entitled The Role of the European Trade Union Confederation in Delivering the EU Pillar of Social Rights. Over to you, Lina.
Thank you very much. And let me just get the slides up and running. So, okay, there we are. So indeed, thank you very much for this opportunity and this invitation to write a relatively short paper telling everybody what we are doing in the ETUC, in the European Trade Union Confederation, when it comes to the pillar. Here you see some logos. Yeah, you see our ETUC logo, but you also see the logo that we are using for the European Pillar of Social Rights. And the third one, which says People's Recovery, we put in place when the crisis hit, and it became very clear that the recovery cannot be guided or pushed towards economic growth only like it was done after the 2008 financial crisis. So I think everybody who is listening in to this seminar or this important event shares the view that it is necessary to strengthen social rights. And just to remind ourselves what is at the background and where we are. So we have the Lisbon Treaty, which says that the EU strives for a social market economy and social progress. That's all very well, but what we have seen consistently is that the business and the single market have been given precedent over the rights of workers. And the very clear example comes from 2007 from the European Court of Justice's case where a Latvian construction company, Laval, sued the Swedish trade unions who was taking industrial action to defend agreed wages and conditions of the workers in Sweden. The Swedish trade unions lost the case, so the priority was put on the freedom to provide services rather than on the protection of workers' rights. There was a Viking case that followed, and there were a number of other cases around that period. And then, of course, we had the 2008 economic crisis that hit us all globally, not only Europe, but globally, and lots of, or most economies worldwide are suffering. And after the crisis, as I said, the economic growth came the panacea. It was the only priority that everybody was after. Now, with hindsight, many people admit that the austerity that was put in place after the crisis, when the first signs of growth started, that it was a wrong policy, it was enacted too soon. So hopefully there are some lessons learned from that crisis when we are dealing with the current ones. So again, what suffered was the social dimension of the European cooperation. And people in Ireland, I think, remember too painfully when the Troika took over and what happened at that time. Some of my presentation has been made really easy by the first panel because Santina covered lots of the action plan that the Commission put forward in the spring. But I would like to just to return to the action plan and also to touch on what the pillar is supposed to be and what it's not supposed to be. So right from the beginning, before the pillar was actually published and before the proclamation in Gothenburg in November 2017, we were working really hard together with the Juncker Commission at the time to actually have important principles included in the pillar. Our General Secretary, I don't know how many hours he spent up in the air going, meeting various prime ministers to convince them that it is important to have the European Pillar of Social Rights and everybody should subscribe to it. The price for this was that we have a pillar that is a strategy. It gives no extra rights for working people or citizens, people living in Europe. And a number of member states insisted that the pillar cannot put in place direct obligations towards them, neither political nor financial. So, but nevertheless, we have the European Pillar of Social Rights, and we took it as an opportunity to really reset the priorities for the European Union and to use it as a backdrop, as a framework for demands for new social legislation. So we've heard at the time when the pillar was published that it's a new agenda. It's a compass for upward convergence towards better living and working conditions. I agree with Santina when she said that despite the fact that the pillar itself is kind of not directly enforceable, but the directives that derive from the implementation of different principles of the pillar, they are enforceable, and the member states have to comply with them. So in the ETUC, we use it indeed as an instrument to insist on and influence the policy at the European level. At the time, already in 2017, we were saying that we need an action plan to actually deliver the European Pillar of Social Rights. And just to again, we have this nice little pie. It has 20 principles. But when you look at these principles, we have to bear in mind the treaties. And why I say this is a very simple reason. In the treaties, we have the division of competencies between member states and the European Union. And half of the principles, the 10 principles that predominantly cover social protection, they remain the competence of national governments. This means that the EU can only take a coordinating action because the lead is in the hands of the member states. For us, from a trade union point of view, this means that the social partners at national level have to play a really vital role in pressing for and monitoring the progress and how, excuse me, how to make sure that the different principles actually get implemented at national level. So this is also just a recap. The action plan, when it was published this year in the spring, it was presented as the new social rule book. For us, it was important to have a strong social Europe for just transition and recovery. And yet again, we started working with the European Commission well before the action plan was published to make sure that what was going to be included in the action plan, that it prioritized the gaps and the shortcomings that we were seeing through our members in the European labor market, in the social protection systems, in the healthcare and elsewhere. So for us, what was really important was that the action plan puts people's well-being, social progress, upward convergence, job-rich recovery, adequate working conditions, quality jobs, decent living and social protection at the forefront. When it was published, unfortunately, actions are not always as ambitious as we hoped for, and as the various speeches at European level from commissioners, from presidents, vice presidents would have suggested. I think this one has been covered well by Santina and the speakers in the first panel already, but I just wanted to emphasize that even before the social and economic damage inflicted by the COVID pandemic, the action from the Commission was a little bit slow. Juncker Commission started basically in his last year or 1.5 years before their term ran out. So they basically just ran out of time to have lots of different proposals on the table to start implementing the pillar. But the action plan was also important for us from a point of view precisely of the change of the Commission. We needed the action plan to make sure that the new European Commission would continue with the work that the Juncker Commission started on strengthening social Europe. So there are just some of the calls that we put forward for the initiatives that we wanted to see. So we wanted to see strengthened trade union and workers' rights, strong attention to education and training, and especially bearing in mind the just transition and the digital transition that we are all facing, youth employment, gender equality, extremely important, health and safety at work. Work-life balance was, the directive actually came already during the Juncker cabinet, but work-life balance has been high up on the agenda yet again because of the COVID pandemic. We are teleworking and we need initiatives to make sure that we are still working normal hours and not very extensive and extended hours. We need social protection and proper pension. We need to combat the undeclared and insecure work, minimum income, combating social dumping, stronger public services, child protection. From trade union point of view, we consider that in order to really properly implement the European Pillar of Social Rights, we need strong social dialogue. We need also workplace democracy, and we need to have the right to collective bargaining. Many speakers have mentioned the draft directive on minimum wage, but it is the directive that addresses not only the minimum wage, but it also addresses precisely the issue of collective bargaining coverage, trying to push the member states towards strengthening collective bargaining and social dialogue in member states. Because unfortunately, what we have seen is that there are member states that actively work to destroy social dialogue, and that has to stop. To implement, obviously, we need the full range of various instruments, everything that is available at European level. So we need legislation and policy measures. We need targets and standards. So we have, together with the pillar, we have the social scoreboard. And now we also, at the European level social partners, so trade unions and employers, we have agreed on a set of indicators that are supposed to take us beyond the GDP. Because so far our well-being has been, or lots of economists and lots of politicians insist measuring the GDP only, but this is a poor measure to measure well-being. So we agreed indicators that go well beyond. And our joint indicators were actually picked up by the European Council in Porto in their final statement. Very important aspects, as the European pillar is supposed to be implemented through the European semester, we really need to make sure that the social priorities are included in the European semester and in the country-specific recommendations. Last year, we didn't have, because of COVID crisis, we didn't have country-specific recommendations, but we have been told that they will be back in the semester cycle that is starting now. We need the multi-annual financial framework and the recovery and resilience facility that are based and take into account the principles of the European Pillar of Social Rights when the allocations are decided. And of course, as a backdrop to everything, there are also United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. But as I said, half of the pillar principles are in the hands of the member states. So the member states need to step up to make sure that we actually implement the pillar properly. So there are some other aspects, elements that are split between different priorities, sort of how do we create more and better jobs. In order to create job opportunities, we need the real economy developing in a positive direction. We need proper industrial strategy for Europe, and especially with the green transition and digital transition. We need to make the working standards fit for the future. We need proper occupational health and safety standards, and we need safe and secure labor mobility without undermining the working conditions and wages inside the European Union. So we need investment in skills and education, and we need to really build equality, because unfortunately inequality in all its dimensions has grown since the 2008 crisis, and now even more, even if there was a slight improvement before the COVID crisis hit. For the social protection, we of course need, especially when we are looking at the retired people, elderly people, we need a life in dignity. We need to have proper healthcare and long-term care. And we need to have social protection that is fit for the new world of work. For delivering all this, we need to join the forces. We need to unlock the social investment through the structural funds and the RRF, which is the Recovery and Resilience Facility. All social actors need to speak with one voice, pushing the European Union and the member states towards deepening and strengthening the social Europe. We need a strengthened coordination and monitoring through the European semester. And why I say this is that although at European level, we have a very good cooperation as social partners, so trade unions and employers organizations at European level when it comes to the European semester. But we run regular surveys every year asking our members how much they are involved in the semester process back at home. And unfortunately, the picture is not rosy at all. The involvement of social partners is either very formal. In very few member states, there are more discussions on the substance, but in lots of the member states, the social partners are excluded. So we need to concentrate on the implementation of and enforcing the actual social acquis. There is quite a bit of it around, but we need to also concentrate on the proper application and enforcement. And as I mentioned, of course, there are also the UN Agenda 2030 Sustainable Development Goals that also all our member states need to implement. So where are we so far? So there has been action on some job security and gender pay transparency, work-life balance, a just transition for workers. There has been a draft directive on collective bargaining and minimum wage, on the protection for cross-border workers. Also some action on socializing the European semester. There are some kind of green shoots and we haven't lost hope completely. And of course, we need to influence the post-COVID recovery plans in member states. So, as I said at the beginning on the first slide, there was the logo of the People's Recovery. And for us, before even the Recovery and Resilience Facility discussion started, we said that the social objectives have to be put at the heart of the EU's recovery. And we took it as an opportunity also to get the pillar included as one of the main criteria or conditionalities for evaluating the proposed expenditure under the RRF, so in the national recovery and resilience plans. Fair minimum wages have been mentioned many times. So for us, this is at the core of Europe's recovery. We have too many working poor. This needs to be remedied. We need to make sure that minimum wages are fair, even better if we can really achieve a living wages in Europe. So we need to end the in-work poverty and inequalities that exist. And as I mentioned already, strengthening collective bargaining and the respect, of course, of existing national trade union negotiating systems is a core. Platform work, very important aspect with the developments in our economies. We know that when the platform started operating, they were trying to convince us that it's an innovative economic activity. But actually what they were doing was they were just using modern tools to provide very old-fashioned services. If you take the taxi driving, if you take delivery services, sorry, this is nothing innovative. It's just the way they use people to provide these services was new. So we wanted to, or we still demand that there has to be, when the proposal comes out on the 8th, at the moment it's planned to come out on the 8th of December, that the companies cannot force workers into false self-employment. And we also need to have in this legislation the rebuttable presumption of employment, which means that anybody who is engaged in the platform, they are presumed to be employed unless the platform proves otherwise, that the workers are genuinely freelance. So already in 2019, we had the transparent and predictable working conditions. And this is important because when we start working, we need to know what our rights are. And so this is, you can see, member states have until August 22 to comply with the directive to transpose it into national systems. Pay transparency. It is extremely important for achieving gender pay equality. It is still work in progress. There are many, many problems and issues in this directive, but we are working hard together with the European Parliament to try to have a very strong position from the European Parliament, so that that directive, when it is finalized, actually helps to reduce the pay gap. Then for the mobile workers and for posted workers, the European Labour Authority was set in place. There were lengthy negotiations and debates on what the Labour Authority should really cover and what it should really do. It's still not the kind of authority that, for example, the banks have, or the competition authority. It doesn't have the teeth, it doesn't have the power, but it's the first step, and hopefully it will help to combat social dumping, fight abuses in labor mobility, in the social security, cross-border social security, and also false self-employment and other aspects. Work-life balance, as I mentioned, the directive was published 19. It extended leave for fathers, for carers, and as I mentioned, also very important aspect that comes under work-life balance, but hopefully is going to be addressed in a separate legal instrument at European level, is the right to disconnect. Health and safety principles, I think these have already been mentioned by Santina also, that there is a new occupational safety and health strategy, and there are further proposals coming next year to reduce workers' exposure to hazardous chemicals. In the social protection, yes, we have the child guarantee, we have the platform for combating homelessness, we have the affordable housing initiative, and guidance to member states relating to public procurement. And we are expecting the Council recommendation on minimum income. I will come back to the issue of recommendation slightly later. Just transition. There needs to be a strong social protection and skills from our point of view, and that's what we've been pushing for all throughout the Green European Green Deal and discussions on what next. We need really robust social dialogue and the creation of high quality jobs. And the ETUC was really active in working with the European Commission to have the Just Transition Fund put in place that supports the regions that are most affected when they strive towards a carbon neutral economy. So the Commission, when it comes to creating job opportunities in the real economy, as I mentioned, we need new industrial strategy, without which it is impossible to really make real progress. Because just transition doesn't mean that we close the polluting industries. We train, retrain, reskill people, but if we don't create new alternative jobs for these people, they will be just highly skilled, highly trained, unemployed people. And this is no good for anyone, not for the economy, not for the people, not for the regions. The action plan on social economy is coming very soon. What we want to see is that the SURE instrument actually has been evaluated, and it has been evaluated as a success. So we want to have a permanent instrument at European level that would be in place in case of future crisis. Then, of course, you have this, the Commission encourages, that comes from the action plan. And you see many aspects that the Commission is encouraging the member states to do. And this is one of the big problems, precisely, that the Commission can only encourage. It can't really strongly insist or force member states to do lots of things when it comes to social. Again, as I started at the beginning, this goes back to the treaties. The way the treaties have been drafted, they have been agreed to. We have at the moment in Europe the a conference on the future of Europe, where we are supposed to be looking at where next, or what we need to do to improve the connection between the European Union and the people, and whether there are aspects and elements that need to be improved. And one is definitely that we need to take a really critical look at how much European Union, European Commission can have a say when it comes to the social field in Europe. Here it's the investing in skills. Again, it comes from the action plan, so I'm not going to stop here for the sake of time. I'm very conscious that the time is running. So health and social protection, again, there are initiatives that are in their action plan and that we all need to work on. These are very important aspects and have been mentioned also by previous speakers already. So from our point of view, when we analyzed the action plan, when it was published, we looked at what we asked for, what we wanted to see, and what is missing or what is there but is weak. So the need to prolong emergency measures, the urgency doesn't seem to come through. When we're talking about economic governance, the escape clause that sits in the Stability and Growth Pact that tends to tie the member states' hands when it comes to public investment is activated until the end of 2022, meaning that the Commission is not going to put forward country-specific or fiscal recommendations to countries to curtail their public spending, at least something. But we need to look beyond the 2022, and that's another field where ETUC is working very hard and very actively to actually have the Stability and Growth Pact reformed in a way that doesn't constrain the member states, but actually facilitates public investment and also in the social field.
Lena,
yeah.
I think we're a small bit stuck for time, unfortunately.
Okay, I'll go faster. Maybe I'll go to the last slide, which is one of the most important ones. So we are saying joining the forces to deliver, and here you see various different instruments that we can use in order to really implement the pillar and to improve the to improve the functioning of social Europe, that we really can have the social market economy as the treaty says. The key for us is precisely the economic governance and the semester. And as I said, the revision of the economic governance is open now. The discussions on also revising the semester, how it functions, is also being discussed. And one of the very important elements that we want to see in the revision of the economic governance is that we have the macroeconomic scoreboard. We have the macroeconomic provisions in the Stability and Growth Pact, but we want the balancing arm. So we want to have the social imbalances procedure to balance the macroeconomic imbalances procedure. So it's not only the economy, but it's also the social. So when economies are looked at, they need to be looked at from a point of view, are the economies delivering for people? Are they also delivering for social? And this is one of the very kind of new initiatives that has cautiously been, the debate has started. The very first discussion was in October in the Social Affairs Council, and we are waiting very much to see and pushing also this social imbalances procedure to actually see light, to really become part of the governance of the European Union, to make sure that we are not going to see the kind of recovery that we saw after the 2008 crisis, where economy grew, but people were left behind. So these are the very important aspects from our point of view, and where our work continues. And the key for us is precisely the strategy, the backdrop of the European Pillar of Social Rights. So whatever happens in member states at EU level, everything has to take the principles on board and has to work towards implementing these principles. So thank you very much. Here below you see a web address to our website on the pillar. There are easy explanations of what the different principles are, what they are addressing, and how this is done. So thank you very much and sorry for being long.
No, you're quite all right. Thank you very much, Lena. It was a very interesting and informative presentation. Now we have our next paper involves two joint speakers, joint presentation. We have Ana Guillen, who's a professor of sociology at the University of Oviedo in Spain. She's also the director of the PRO MEBI research group, which is promoting work and welfare in Europe. Also presenting with Anna, we have Maria Petmessidou, who is emeritus professor at the Democritus University in Greece. She has served as the chair of the sociology department of Crete University, as well as the Department of Social Administration at the university. I'm not sure, the title of the paper is A Green and More Social Pillar for European Pillar of Social Rights. Maria or Anna, I'm not sure which of you wishes to go first.
Maria, Professor Maria Petmessidou starting. Thank you very much for your invitation. And then I'll follow on what Professor Petmessidou has to say. Thank you.
Do you want to go ahead, Maria?
Unmuted? Yes, I'm unmuted. Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you now, Maria. Thank you.
Can Suzanne make the share screen for us? Because we have some, unless, I mean, I can do this as well, but Suzanne said that she would do this.
Suzanne?
We can do it all right. I have enabled the system that you and Anna can simultaneously share.
Okay, I will start the share screen. Okay, can you see it?
Yes, we have that. Yeah.
Yeah. Just okay. Our presentation has a slightly different focus. It doesn't focus primarily on the European Pillar of Social Rights, but it tries to outline the social dimensions of the European Green Deal in this aim of just transition. This is based on a paper that myself and Anna have jointly written. And this paper tried to delineate a research agenda for the challenges facing the European Union under this combined impact of a triple transition: green, digital, and demographic. Of course, we cannot expand on all these issues. In this presentation, we'll talk about these three issues you see on this slide. I will start by briefly outlining the social objectives of the European Green Deal, and also I will focus on some very important missing social dimensions of the Green Deal. Then I will try somehow to show how the EGD's programmatic social goals coordinate with some major strategic pronouncements of the EU in the last decade, mainly the social investment approach and the European Pillar of Social Rights. And then Anna will take over to talk about some critical steps towards bolstering the just transition goal, and she will also wrap up our main arguments. Now, by and large, green growth and just sustainability are held to be compatible and complementary in the EGD, but also in some major strategic texts by other international organizations like the UN SDGs and similar texts by the ILO. And all of these strategic texts, they share a common definition of social justice, namely as a crucial component of a development path relying heavily on a mutually beneficial link between economics and the environment. And this kind of definition derives from the Brundtland Report of 1987 that developed a needs-based framework as a mediating factor between economic goals and social and environmental goals. But apart from that, apart from this common definition of social justice, we see significant differences in these strategic texts regarding the breadth of the just and fair transition notion. And we distinguish between a broad definition that points to the need for a comprehensive approach to the distributional impact of the triple transition, green, digital, and demographic, and of the mitigation and adaptation policies across populations and regions. And on the other hand, we have a very narrow definition targeted particularly on programs of support for workers that have lost their jobs due to environmental protection policies. And somehow the broad definition is more clearly adopted by the ILO and the UN SDGs, especially in the case of the European Green Deal. What we see is that there is a controversial stance by the EGD. On the one hand, we have the minimalist and vague motto of no one must be left behind, that somehow hints at a comprehensive view of distributional issues, but we are not exactly told what sort of policies we need to implement for achieving this comprehensive view of distributional issues. And on the other hand, most of the policies deriving from the EGD are framed in a narrow view, that of responding to the blow of job and income losses as a result of the decarbonization of production and consumption patterns. Now, there are some very important missing social dimensions in the EGD. First, the systemic feedback loops between the three transitions, green, digital, and demographic, and the pressures these exert on public budgets are not extensively factored into in the EGD's policy framework. And particularly the double bind in which welfare states are caught under the triple transition is hardly addressed. Namely, social spending competes with pressures on public budgets for offsetting climate change. At the same time, new forms of work and changing labor demands and demographic aging greatly narrow the fiscal base of the public budgets. And these pressures are further compounded by the unprecedented accumulation of public debts during the pandemic, as most of the member states have implemented lifelines for their economies. And I think that these pressures are more acute in the case of member states that were highly indebted even before the pandemic. And in this respect, the question of in which form the Stability and Growth Pact will be reinstated is very important, because an abrupt switch towards fiscal consolidation will highly exacerbate these pressures. Another important missing social dimension is that neither the EGD, the text itself, nor the communication that explains its main goals make any specific and explicit reference to inequality and to social rights. And this is an indication that the EGD neglects the broader distributional effects of environmental policies. Also, the narrow definition of just transition reveals significant protection gaps, particularly among groups furthest from the labor market, and I think the previous speakers have talked about this issue. And last but not least, a gender lens is missing from the EGD, as is also the intersection between class, ethnicity, and gender, even though the existing literature demonstrates quite clearly that climate change and environmental degradation and the adaptation and mitigation responses are indeed gendered. And of course, the intersection between class, gender, and ethnicity intensified vulnerabilities vis-a-vis climate change and ecological degradation. Now, let me very briefly try to respond to this issue of how the EGD's programmatic social goals coordinate with these two major social pronouncements of the EU in the last decade, namely the social investment approach and the European pillar. This overhead presents in a very schematic way how EU social policy evolved over the last 3 decades. But the first remark that one should make is that overall, a stop and go or a disjointed manner is a major hallmark of how EU social policy has developed so far. And also, until quite recently, there was no concern for joining social and environmental concerns. Now, if we start in the mid to late 90s, we see that the DeLorean proactive and quite comprehensive approach to an integrated European social policy lost momentum and was replaced by an emphasis on mutual learning for modernizing the welfare state, through the so-called soft governance framework, the open method of coordination. In 2013, that is in the aftermath of the debt crisis in Europe, we observe an ambitious turn to social investment, and this turn advocated prevention against social risks through extensive investment in human capital, along the lines of the Nordic social democratic model that sees social policy, social expenditure as investment rather than cost. But quite soon, this comprehensive social investment approach was discontinued and was replaced by a light liberal social investment version that was very much in tune with the austerity mantra during the debt crisis and a little after the debt crisis. Now, in 2017, we have the European Pillar of Social Rights, which, as the other speakers have talked about quite extensively. This is a principles-based approach. It has no binding force, though. The interesting thing is that the EPSR has further overshadowed the social investment approach in its heavy Nordic version and shifted again emphasis to the light version, making social protection subject to labor market inclusion, to activation, employability, and so on and so forth. For the first time in 2019, the EGD expresses a concern to link social and environmental concerns and goals, but still in the EGD we have no reference to comprehensive social investment, and invocation of the European Pillar of Social Rights boils down to a narrow targeted support to geographical areas, sectors, and people hardest hit by the transition. Now there is a high rhetoric surrounding the action plan of the European Pillar of Social Rights, and this indicates that the 20 principles will be held to be the beacon towards a transition to climate neutrality, digitalization, and demographic change that is socially fair and just. But again, the narrow definition of just transition to which the EGD clings, that relies on a combination of social buffers and vocational education and retraining policies for the most affected groups of workers and localities, risks being yet another failed flexicurity blueprint that reproduces a troublesome relationship between labor deregulation and social policy. So I will stop here and hand over to Anna. I have to stop sharing my screen unless Anna wants me to change the overheads. Anna, would you like me to change the overheads as you go?
Well, that would be absolutely wonderful. What an offer.
You can take over now. Yeah.
Okay, thank you so much. I think at this moment, people are starting to be absolutely desperate for lunch, so I'll try to be as brief as possible, okay? Now, I will close our presentation by referring to some reflections on critical steps towards bolstering the just transition role. And I would say that to begin with, and this is very disappointingly, two recent programmatic tests, namely the action plan for the implementation of the European Pillar of Social Rights, and also the 8th Environmental Action Programme, the EAP, share the ambiguities of the ERD. This is how both Maria Betnessi and myself interpret it. To begin with, the action plan's ambitious title, A Strong Social Europe for Just Transition and Recovery, does not very much match the content. Secondly, expectations for an emboldened pillar vis-a-vis the environmental crisis and inequality are hardly met. And third and last, the action plan is rather a revamped version of the EU 2020 agenda, leaning towards a light, let's call it liberal, social investment perspective. Namely, also these texts we set for 2030, two targets of the agenda of the previous decade. For example, the employment and poverty reduction rates, which failed to be achieved, most blatantly the poverty reduction target. And also it adds a third one aiming to empower lifelong learning. Also, the European Pillar of Social Rights needs programmatic status is also reflected in the very narrow scope of new legislative initiatives under the action plan. Similarly, concerns that the ambitions stipulated by the 8th EAP will not result in effective policies have been raised in the recently carried out public consultation on the Commission's draft. First, for an inclusive transition, we find that a legally enforceable social rule book is absolutely crucial, and also that the right to a healthy environment should be set at its very core. This would require setting at the core of the EPSR a broadly defined right to protection of health that underscores the right to a healthy environment. This right to a healthy environment is essential for ensuring adequate living and working conditions that promote the enjoyment of health for all, and not only pertaining to the workplace, as is the case now with the social pillar. Importantly also, expanding the right to health so as to include appropriate environmental conditions for the realization of most other essential rights, for example, to food, housing, to work, can strengthen social citizenship as a core idea of the EPSR, supportive of inclusive transition. Obviously, this is a broad definition, but such a broad definition of health protection is already described in the European Social Charter and signals the importance of the links between the environmental challenges, health, and well-being, which the pandemic has very emphatically revealed. Second, the EU's governance framework needs to be broadened, as has already been pointed out in several presentations this morning. Particularly, in our view, particularly important is to upgrade the social scope of the European semester in order to closely monitor the social rights and the environmental change interface. Third, in line with the above, a robust monitoring framework is essential in steering the triple transition. Available Eurostat data sets and indicators, for example, on the Sustainable Development Goals, on EU 2020, on the EPSR, and on environment and energy issues, cover a wide range of social inequality, social exclusion issues, on the one hand, and also on greenhouse emissions, air pollutants, biodiversity, and energy on the other hand. Still, information on the social environmental linkages is very scarce. Commonly agreed EU overarching indicators on environmental change, eco-social divides, labor market, and demographic polarization are crucial for broadening the EU's governance framework, building equity in its green growth goals, and also for the achievement of greater policy coherence. So, to conclude, to wrap up, the absence of a strong social rule book to underpin the urgent and ambitious green transition aimed at by the EGB casts serious doubts as to whether an encompassing just transition framework can be developed. Further, the more so as the disjointed manner without clear priorities characterizing the development of EU-level social policy and the predominance of soft law hardly favor a comprehensive approach to the wide-ranging distributional impacts. And finally, the complex challenge of aligning stakeholders at various levels. For example, the supranational, national, and regional local levels. This weighs heavily on any critical steps towards a just, equity-focused, eco-social transformation. And this is an issue that research has barely tackled so far, and is desperately needed to be done so. So thank you very much for your attention. This is the end of our presentation. It's already 2 o'clock. I don't know whether it's time for questions or not, but whoever would like to pose questions or comments is very welcome. Thank you.
Anna, thank you very much. As you say, it's 2 o'clock your time. It's 1 o'clock our time, but I'm sure it's over for lunch for you. But we have a couple of minutes, just a few questions. Just if I could direct one, and I don't want to be too specific to any of our speakers, but Alina, if I could just ask you one question in particular that has come in, and that is in relation to the evidence is that higher rates of trade union membership is linked to lower rates of in-work poverty, with so many more now employed on zero-hour contracts, on low pay and in precarious platform gig economy style jobs. Is it difficult to attract members who struggle to make ends meet, never mind pay union dues, despite being the groups most in need of representation? And what can be done about that?
Thank you very much for the question. Organizing is never easy. And I must also point out that the 0 hours contract is something that is very popular in the Anglo-Saxon world. It is not so prevalent in the continental Europe. There have been some member states that have tried to introduce 0 hours contracts, but we have tried to fight against it. We have tried to stop it, but most member states do not have 0 hours contract. A different story are the gig workers, the freelancers, and especially the ones working in the platforms. If you are dealing with delivery workers, for example, they usually have a place where they gather. And so as a union, you can go and you can recruit. And in some of the member states, the recruitment actually has been quite successful. And the unions have organized them. But these tend to be the member states where the trade union membership is higher already. So there is the culture of joining unions, and so it's also easier to recruit these kind of workers. Very different issue is how do you really recruit the people who are working online, who you don't have physical access to. But there are some very few, but some good examples where this has also been done. Can't now remember which of the countries did it. And then a separate issue yet again is the legal status of self-employed, and whether self-employed can organize and whether they can collectively bargain. I didn't mention it in my presentation, but also at European level, there is another serious discussion going on whether the self-employed being able to collectively bargain is against the competition policy, and whether it's a cartel or whether it's a collective bargaining. We are saying it's a collective bargaining, and they must have a right to collectively bargain, and especially the dependent self-employed workers.
Okay, Leah, thank you very much for that. Just briefly, our other three speakers, if I could ask you individually, Bia, if I may go to you first, in terms of returning perhaps to the virtuous circle that you mentioned, or at least getting rid of the pro-poverty kind of attitudes we seem to have in areas of the Union. Do you see a new paradigm emerging to combat that in light of the pandemic? And just, I might as well just ask, after you're finished, be Anna and Maria, if individually, if one of you could, or both of you, excuse me, could address similarly, do you see a new paradigm emerging that will make the just transition, hopefully, a bit more attainable? I'll go to you first, Bea.
Yes. Well, I'm not sure. If we look at the responses to social security, basically what we do observe is that the COVID related social risks, so also new social risks in a sense, have been protected much more than the old social risks. And so in a sense, the dualization in social protection that we have seen in the past decades between increasingly better protection for work-rich households, for the middle classes, and on the other hand, downward pressures on protection for those at the bottom. In a sense, this has been reinforced if we look at the responses to the pandemic. So I'm not sure, but as I said, I do believe that the reaction of the EU and how the Commission is now taking forward the European Pillar of Social Rights. This is also connected in one way or another to the pandemic, and this I think is really yes, I would call it a pandemic change. But I'm not sure that the immediate responses of the governments to the pandemic, that this reflected the change that we need.
Oh, okay, thank you. And briefly, Maria, if I could go to you first about just transition, and then Anna, perhaps. You're on mute, Maria, there, I think.
I forget. Yeah, sorry. Yeah, my answer will be very short. I don't think there are any clear signs that there is a paradigmatic change at the moment. Of course, there has been a solidaristic switch during the pandemic, but it's not clear whether this is not something that had to do only with this occasion of a health crisis that impacted on the whole of Europe, and also a debt crisis that impacted on the whole of Europe. I think that it's we have to wait and see how the Stability and Growth Pact will be modified. I think this will give the signs of whether there will be a persistent paradigmatic change or not.
Thank you. And Anna, just briefly yourself, yes?
Well, I wouldn't talk about a paradigm at all, the absence of a paradigm. In fact, what we are arguing in our paper is precisely that there is no common definition of just transition within Europe, within the EU, let alone at the international level. You know, what is the meaning of it? Who is affected by it? What it means to put into practice a just transition. Yeah? And this is very worrying, I think.
Okay, Anna, thank you very much. Thank you, Maria, Lena, and Bea. Thank you all for some very interesting papers and plenty of food for thought for all of us here at the conference.